Welcome to Through the Bible in a Year with Pastor John. We invite you to join us at 1 Oakleigh Avenue in North Providence, Rhode Island. This podcast is presented to you by The Way Ministries, supported by listeners like you. For donations, live videos, podcasts, and more, please visit www.thewayministriesri.org. Thank you and have a great day.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Through the Bible in a Year with Pastor John. So glad you could join me today to get a portion of God's Word. Today we're going to begin with day 134, May 13th. Esther, chapter 5 to 7. Haman's humiliation. Overview. Esther knows full well that entering the king's throne room uninvited could prove hazardous to her health. For Esther courageously discovers that God has once again prepared the way. She invites King Xerxes and Haman to a special banquet in their honor, and there repeats the invitation for the next day as well. But before that fatal second banquet, Haman erects a pole 75 feet high on which to impale Mordecai. Xerxes discovers Mordecai's unrewarded heroism, and Haman watches the honor he had craved go to Mordecai. At the second banquet, Haman is unmasked and dies the very death he planned for Mordecai. Chapter 5. Haman's haughtiness. First banquet. Chapter 6. Haman's humiliation. Forgotten bravery. Chapter 7. Haman's execution. Fateful banquet. Insight. A very public execution. Esther 5:14. The excessive height of Haman's pole, 5'14", 75 feet, or at least as high as the city walls, was designed to ensure that Mordecai's downfall would be a citywide spectacle, visible both inside and outside the walls. Instead, Haman himself received the notoriety. Insight. Trouble sleeping. Esther 6:1. Kings who can't sleep at night here, 6:1, and in Daniel 2:1 and 6:18, seems to be a common theme during the captivity. And every time this royal insomnia is mentioned, God radically intervenes in the lives of his people and in the affairs of an empire. The stories in Esther and Daniel 6 also end with the humiliating execution of ungodly enemies. Esther, chapter 5. Esther's request to the king. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. Then the king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom." And Esther replied, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." The king turned to his attendants and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet, as Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. And while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "Now tell me what you really want. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Esther replied, "This is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and if it please the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about." Haman's plan to kill Mordecai. Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet, but when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. Then Haman added, "And that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. And she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow." Then he added, But this is all worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting there at the palace gate. So Haman's wife Zeresh and all his friends suggested, set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, you could go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole set up. Esther chapter 6. The king honors Mordecai. That night, the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. Who is that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. So the attendants replied to the king, Haman is out in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? So he replied, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with the royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Excellent, the king said to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested. So Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home dejected and completely humiliated. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends what had happened, his wise advisers and his wife said, since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. Esther chapter 7. The king executes Haman. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom. Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. Who would do such a thing? King Xerxes demanded. Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? Esther replied, this wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy. Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out to the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. The king exclaimed, will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes? And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. Then impale Haman on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. My daily walk. Do you believe in prayer? Esther believed in prayer enough to go before the king at an unappointed time with an unlikely request, though it could have meant swift death, 411-1652. Would you have done that? The story is told of a Midwestern town suffering under a searing drought. All the townspeople finally decided it was time to gather the clergy and assemble for prayer. The whole town turned out to pray for rain, but only one person, a small girl, brought her umbrella. When you pray, are you like the townspeople or the little girl? Do you, like Esther, pray first and then live in the confidence of God's answer? Are your prayers specific enough that when God answers you notice a difference? In the margin, write down a specific request for provision, protection, or guidance. For the next week, focus your prayers on that item. You might even want to put your umbrella in an unusual place to remind you throughout the week to watch for God's answer. Prayers made in faith and in harmony with God's will are forecasts of the future. That's so true. That's all for today, my friends. It was great reading along with you. Have a great day. God bless. And I will see you tomorrow, Lord willing. Peace.